So, Far Cry 6. Ubisoft's latest attempt to keep this franchise running while ignoring the fact that it's on life support. I've played this game extensively, and here's the thing. It's not bad. It's actually pretty fun, in that mindless, turn-your-brain-off-and-explode-stuff way. But the real problem? It has no soul. This game is Ubisoft on autopilot. Big open-world, checklist-style gameplay, a villain who should be great but isn't, and a story that pretends to say something while actually saying nothing. So today, let's do a deep dive and figure out what went wrong. Ubisoft has been making the same game since 2012. Back in Far Cry 3, this structure was revolutionary. You had this massive open world, dynamic outpost takeovers, and a compelling villain in Vars. But what's changed since then? Every game after Far Cry 3 has just been an incremental update, adding more stuff without actually evolving. Ubisoft thinks bigger maps, more guns, and more collectibles equals better game. But in reality, it just means more bloat. #subsection meaningless progression. The biggest issue? Nothing you do feels impactful. You liberate an outpost? Cool, but Castillo's forces don't care. You complete missions? The world doesn't change. Even your gear doesn't really matter. The game is designed so that most weapons feel the same, and upgrades just make slight tweaks to numbers. There's no real sense of progression, and that makes the entire experience feel hollow. Let's talk about Yara, because on the surface, it's stunning. Ubisoft's world design team knows how to make a beautiful setting, and this game is no exception. But beauty isn't enough. A truly great open world reacts to the player. But in Far Cry 6, nothing feels alive. Civilians just stand around. There's no dynamic world state that evolves as you progress. In Red Dead Redemption 2, you see the world changing. People remember your actions, towns evolve, and everything feels real. But in Far Cry 6, Yara is just a backdrop. Even when you cause mayhem, civilians barely react. It kills immersion. Far Cry villains have always been a big deal. Ubisoft hypes them up like they're the heart of the experience. And sometimes, that's true. Vars was an unpredictable force of chaos. Pagan Min was charming but terrifying. Joseph Seed had this unsettling presence that made you question everything. And then, there's Anton Castillo. On paper, he should be one of the best villains in the series. He's played by Giancarlo Esposito, an actor who can make any character instantly compelling. His presence, his delivery, it's all perfect. But there's one massive problem. Ubisoft's writing does him no favors. The best villains in gaming don't just exist in cutscenes. They interact with you, they react to you, they remind you why they're a threat. Vars tortured you. Pagan Min would call you mid-mission, mocking you or offering deals. Joseph Seed's cult was everywhere, actively hunting you down. Castillo, he just gives speeches on TV. He's not a presence in your story, he's background noise. You can be tearing through his entire army, and he doesn't even seem to care. There's no escalation, no real tension, just scripted events that happen whether you succeed or fail. And that's where this whole dictator concept falls apart. He never truly feels like he's in control. He's not reacting to you, adapting, hunting you down. He's just there. Then there's Diego, his son. The writers clearly wanted this father-son dynamic to be compelling. Castillo raising his heir, shaping him into the next dictator, while Diego himself questions whether he wants this life. It's a solid idea, but it goes nowhere. Diego spends the game standing in the background, looking conflicted, but it never leads to anything meaningful. No real arc, no major choice. He exists just to make Castillo seem more human, and that's it. And when it comes time for the final confrontation, you'd expect something huge, right? A last stand? A real moment where Castillo shows you why he's a feared dictator? Nope. Just another cutscene. No real fight, no sense of victory, just an ending that happens. And that's it. Anton Castillo could have been one of the greatest villains in Far Cry history. Instead, he's one of the most forgettable. And it's not because of Esposito, it's because Ubisoft didn't know what to do with him. Ubisoft has a weird relationship with politics. They love setting their games in politically charged environments, dictatorships, revolutions, cults, but the moment you ask them what they're trying to say, they panic. Far Cry 6 is set in Yara, a fictional country that's very obviously inspired by Cuba. You've got a brutal dictator, an oppressed population, guerrilla warfare. It's all here. But the second anyone asks if this game is making a political statement, Ubisoft's response is, "Oh no, we're not taking sides." And that's the problem. This game wants to feel meaningful, wants to feel like a story about revolution, but it refuses to commit. What is Far Cry 6 actually saying about dictatorship? About revolution? About power? Nothing. It throws these themes into the mix, but never explores them in a meaningful way. Take Dani Rojas, your protagonist. In theory, they're part of the revolution, fighting for a free Yara. But do they really have any personal stake in this? Do they struggle with the morality of war? Do they ever make hard choices that shape the future of the country? No, because Far Cry 6 isn't interested in those questions. It just wants you to blow stuff up. And that would be fine, if the game didn't pretend to be deep. But instead, it keeps throwing serious moments at you, only to completely undercut them 5 minutes later. 1 second, you're watching a gut-wrenching scene about Castillo's cruelty. The next, you're running around with an attack crocodile or delivering pizzas on a motorbike. That tonal whiplash is everywhere. The game wants you to take its story seriously until it doesn't, and that makes it impossible to get invested. Other games have handled revolution so much better. Look at Red Dead Redemption 2. When you fight for something in that game, you feel the weight of it. Your choices matter. The world reacts. But in Far Cry 6, nothing you do actually changes Yara. Whether you liberate a region or ignore it, Castillo still acts the same. The people don't rise up. The world doesn't evolve. You're just checking off objectives until the story decides it's time to end. And that's the final nail in the coffin. This game pretends to be about revolution, but at its core, it's just another Far Cry power fantasy. It says it's about fighting oppression, but all it really wants is for you to turn your brain off and blow things up. And if that's the case, why even bother pretending? All right, let's talk about the gameplay. Because if you strip away the story, the politics, the setting, what you're left with is Far Cry's core loop. Running, gunning, and blowing stuff up. And to be fair, it's still fun. The gunplay is smooth, the explosions are satisfying, and there's a ton of stuff to mess around with. But here's the issue. We've done all of this before. Far Cry 6 doesn't feel like a fresh new entry. It feels like an expansion pack for Far Cry 5. And that game already felt like an expansion pack for Far Cry 4. The formula hasn't changed in years. You've got outposts to clear? Yep. Random enemies spawning out of nowhere? Of course. The same sneak or go loud approach to every mission? You bet. Ubisoft keeps adding things, but they never seem to actually innovate. Like the new Supremo backpacks, these things were supposed to be a game changer, giving you superpowers like firing homing rockets or unleashing EMP blasts. Sounds cool, right? Except in practice, they're just gimmicks. You'll use them once in a while, but they don't actually change how you play. Most of the time, you'll just stick to regular guns because they're more reliable. Speaking of guns, there's a ton of them, and yet they all kind of feel the same. Sure, you've got makeshift resolver weapons, but most of them are just variations of the same mechanics we've seen for years. You can mod them with different ammo types, but since enemies are basically bullet sponges, it doesn't feel like real customization. It just feels like another hoop to jump through. And then there's the AI. Or what Ubisoft is calling AI. Enemies in this game are dumb. Like, really dumb. You can take out one guy and his buddy won't even notice. You can cause total chaos, and half the time, the enemies just stand there waiting to get shot. And this isn't some stealth game behavior. This is just bad AI design. The same goes for vehicles. Driving still feels floaty, and enemy convoys don't actually react to anything. They just drive in their set paths, waiting for you to show up and blow them up. It makes the world feel static, like it's only there for you to play around in, not like a real, living place. And let's talk about mission design, because this is where Far Cry 6 really drops the ball. Almost every single mission follows the same formula. Go here, kill some people, press a button, escape. That's it. There's no real variety, no creative objectives, no moments that make you think, wow, that was different. Even the bigger story missions feel repetitive. You're always either blowing something up, rescuing someone, or gathering intel. And the game never finds ways to surprise you. Compare this to something like Far Cry 3, which had insane moments. Burning a drug field to dubstep, escaping a sinking ship, tripping out on jungle mushrooms. Those missions stood out, but in Far Cry 6, nothing really feels unique. At the end of the day, this gameplay loop is still functional. It still works, but it's safe. It's predictable. It's the exact same experience we've had for over a decade. And when a franchise refuses to evolve, it stops feeling exciting. It starts feeling tired. And that's exactly what Far Cry 6 is, tired. Far Cry games have always been about massive open worlds, huge maps filled with things to do, places to explore, and chaos to unleash. And on the surface, Far Cry 6 follows that formula perfectly. Yara is huge, with dense jungles, sprawling cities, and coastlines that stretch for miles. But here's the problem. For a world this big, it sure feels lifeless. Ubisoft is great at building open worlds, but they're terrible at making them feel alive. Yara is massive, but it doesn't react to you. It doesn't evolve. It's just a backdrop, a playground for explosions with no real depth. Let's start with the civilians. In theory, they're supposed to represent the oppressed people of Yara, the ones you're fighting to free. But in practice, they're just NPCs who walk around aimlessly, barely reacting to anything. You can cause absolute mayhem, blow up a convoy, start a gunfight in the streets, and they'll either do nothing or run away for a few seconds before going back to their usual routines. They don't feel like real people. And the worst part? They don't even seem to care that a revolution is happening. You'd expect to see uprisings, street protests, people fighting back. Instead, the world feels static. Like no matter what you do, Yara is stuck in place. And then there's the wildlife. Far Cry games are known for their insane animal encounters. Bears, tigers, eagles, all attacking at the worst possible moments. And sure, Yara has its fair share of dangerous animals, but their AI is just as dumb as the enemies. Half the time, they either stand there awkwardly or attack without any real logic. Now, let's talk about side content. Ubisoft loves stuffing their open worlds with activities, racing challenges, treasure hunts, random enemy checkpoints. And yeah, there's plenty to do in Yara. But how much of it actually feels rewarding? Most of the time, you're just doing the same repetitive tasks, clearing outposts, collecting resources, hunting animals for upgrades. The game throws content at you, but it never really motivates you to engage with it beyond because it's there. And it doesn't help that there's no real progression. In games like Ghost of Tsushima or The Witcher 3, side quests tell compelling stories or help shape the world. In Far Cry 6, they mostly exist to pad out the map. Even the main cities, which should feel like bustling hubs of culture and resistance, feel empty. You can't meaningfully interact with people, there's no real faction system, and the world never reacts to your actions in a way that feels impactful. The result? A world that looks beautiful in screenshots but feels completely hollow when you're actually playing it. Yara is a missed opportunity, a setting that could have been immersive, vibrant, and full of life. But instead, it's just another Ubisoft open world. Big, repetitive, and ultimately forgettable. All right, let's talk about the story, because if the gameplay is just more of the same, then surely the story should be the thing that sets Far Cry 6 apart, right? Well, not really. On paper, the setup is great. You're Danny Rojas, a former soldier-turned-reluctant guerrilla, fighting to overthrow Anton Castillo, the ruthless dictator of Yara. It's classic Far Cry, one person rising up against an overwhelming force. But the execution? That's where things fall apart. For starters, Danny is one of the most passive protagonists in the entire series. Ubisoft gave them a voice and a personality this time, but it barely matters because they have almost no agency in the story. Things just happen to Danny. They don't drive the plot. They don't make meaningful choices. They're just kind of there, going along with whatever the game throws at them. Compare this to Jason Brody in Far Cry 3. Love him or hate him, he changed over the course of the game, from a scared rich kid to a ruthless killer. His arc was messy, but it was there. But Danny? They're basically the same person from start to finish. There's no real growth, no real emotional weight. Then there's the supporting cast. Far Cry games have always had over-the-top side characters, and this game is no different. You've got quirky guerrilla leaders, weird rebels with strange gimmicks, and a handful of allies who should be interesting, but none of them really stand out. Most of them are just there to give you missions and occasionally crack jokes. They don't feel like real people fighting for their country. They feel like Ubisoft NPCs following a script. And the biggest issue? The story has no tension. The best Far Cry games made you feel the villain's presence. Vars would stalk you. Pagan Min would call you mid-mission. Joseph Seed's cult would hunt you. But in Far Cry 6, Castillo barely reacts to you. He's just in the background, giving speeches while you go off on side quests. There's no sense of escalation, no feeling that you're actually disrupting his control over Yara. And then there's the ending. No spoilers, but let's just say, it's one of the most anticlimactic finales in the entire series. No major twists, no real payoff, just a series of cutscenes that leave you wondering, wait, that's it? Far Cry 6 wants to tell a powerful story about revolution, sacrifice, and oppression, but it never commits to anything. The protagonist is passive, the characters are forgettable, and the villain, despite being played by an incredible actor, never feels like a real threat. It's not the worst story Ubisoft has ever told, but it's easily one of the most disappointing. At this point it's clear, Far Cry 6 isn't a bad game, but it's a game that's completely stuck in the past. Ubisoft has been recycling the same formula for over a decade, and it's starting to wear thin. The open world is massive but lifeless. The gameplay is fun but uninspired. The story wants to be meaningful but never fully commits. And the villain, arguably the biggest selling point, feels completely wasted. And that raises the big question. Where does Far Cry even go from here? Because if Ubisoft keeps making these games the exact same way, people are eventually going to stop caring. We've already seen it happen with Assassin's Creed. They had to shake up the formula with Origins, and even that series is starting to feel stale again. Far Cry needs to evolve. It needs to take risks. It needs to stop feeling like a game that's been copy-pasted from the last one. That means more than just adding gimmicks like Supremo backpacks. It means real innovation, more dynamic gameplay, a world that actually reacts to your actions, a story that gives you real choices and consequences. Imagine a Far Cry where you can actually shape the revolution, where your actions determine how Yara's people respond. Do they see you as a hero, a necessary evil, a future dictator in the making? That's the kind of depth this series needs. Or what if Ubisoft finally ditched the whole one-man army approach? What if you actually had to build a revolution, recruiting fighters, managing resources, choosing how to strike against the regime? A game where strategy matters just as much as gunplay. Because right now, Far Cry is a franchise on autopilot. It's still fun, but it's predictable, it's safe, and that's not what this series was built on. Far Cry 3 redefined open-world shooters. Far Cry 4 refined it, and since then, Ubisoft has just been repeating itself. If Far Cry 7 is just another copy-paste job, it won't be enough. This franchise needs to evolve, or it's going to get left behind. So after all of this, after breaking down the world, the gameplay, the story, and the missed potential, where does that leave Far Cry 6? It's fine. That's the best way to describe it. It's not terrible. It's not unplayable. It's just another Far Cry game. And that's the problem. The things that make Far Cry fun are still here. The chaotic combat, the open-ended missions, the explosive moments where everything spirals out of control. But nothing about it feels fresh or surprising. Far Cry 6 should have been the game to push the series forward. It had all the ingredients: a compelling setting, a powerhouse actor as the villain, a revolution story that could have had real emotional weight. But instead, it plays it safe, sticking to the same formula, the same design choices, the same Ubisoft structure we've seen for years. And the worst part? Ubisoft knows they can do better. They've proven it before. Games like Assassin's Creed Origins, Ghost Recon Wildlands, even Watch Dogs 2 showed that they're capable of taking risks and shaking things up. But Far Cry? It feels like the one franchise they're afraid to evolve. So should you play Far Cry 6? If you're looking for another Ubisoft open-world experience with lots of explosions, sure, you'll have a good time. But if you are hoping for something that moves the series forward, something that challenges the formula, something new, you won't find it here. Far Cry 6 isn't a failure, but it's a missed opportunity. And if Ubisoft keeps playing it safe, the real danger isn't Castillo's dictatorship or a revolution gone wrong. It's that Far Cry as a franchise will stop being relevant altogether.